morning. This is Richard Shu, host of Shu Untied. This morning, I'm really thrilled and honored to have with me as my guest Amar Mehta, who's the Chief Legal Officer at Waymo. Amar, welcome to the program.
Hi, Richard. Thank you for having me.
So, Amar, let me start by asking you perhaps a question you don't get super often, which is why someone with an MIT background and an engineering background decided to go to law school in the first place?
That's a good question. I'm very much an accidental lawyer. I actually never thought I would go to law school. Growing up, I was much more of a math and science kid, and that's how I found my way to MIT. It was only much later that I kind of fell into the law, much like others do. So maybe let me back up and give you kind of a little bit of background about how I got to MIT, and then eventually how I fell into the law.
Please.
So I grew up in Baltimore. I'm first generation. It's kind of the typical immigrant story. My parents came to this country with $8 in their pocket, and as my dad likes to say, when he arrived here, he didn't want to carry his bags, and so he hired a porter and spent half of his money on that. And so we actually started with $4 in this country. But my parents came here to kind of open opportunity for me and give me the American dream, which I'm super thankful for. So I'm a product of our public schools in Baltimore, Maryland, and super fortunate actually, because I think Baltimore is one of the places where really it's a diverse place, racially, ethnically, socioeconomically, and I got to really kind of experience both through high school, a lot of different subjects, a lot of different sports, meet a lot of different kinds of people. But as I said, really math was my first love academically, and that's what led me to MIT. I thought I would be a math professional or an engineer or something like that. And then as I continued my MIT journey, I'll say it was probably the best 4 years of my life. I really enjoyed the experience. Lots of very, very bright people with immense backgrounds. But I realized that mostly through summer internships that software engineering, for example, which is what I was mostly focused on, one, I wasn't as good as I thought I would be kind of in that role. And second is, this changes probably as we get more senior, but at that time was a little bit narrow in the focus. So in my internships, I was focused on very small parts of a very large system that was being built, and did a good job, and whatever I wrote eventually launched, but it didn't feel like I was having the impact that I wanted. And so I was looking for ways where I'm a very intellectually curious person. I think one of the threads you'll see throughout my career is I'm happy to try new things and make changes. A non-linear career path has served me really well. And so my first job after college had nothing to do with engineering. I was a tech investment banker with Credit Suisse First Boston. And I had not taken any finance classes really meaningfully. So there's actually more to talk about there about how I got a job like that. But I took that job because I thought it was a good thread between technology. And so this was a bank that was catering to technology clients and thinking about debt and equity offerings and M&A and so forth. But it was a place where I really built financial skill. And so I was trying to look to see how I could stay in technology, but do something slightly different. Turns out around that time, the dot-com bubble burst. And so there wasn't a lot of activity. It wasn't as vibrant as I had imagined it to be. It was a kind of the job at the time where people were really interested in getting into the space. But when you're there day to day and there's not much going on, it kind of is not the place that at least I wanted to be at that time. And so I was left, and this is now where I'll get to your question of how I ended up in law school. I was left deciding, what do I want to do with my career? I'm now an MIT graduate. I've had my first job. I've built some financial skills, but like I've realized this is not what I want to do. And so I had a bunch of choices. I thought, given the math thread, maybe I want to be an actuary, and I'd actually like taken a few actuarial exams. Do I want to try another finance role that's kind of slightly different? One thread that's been run through my life is like, do I want to start my own company and be more entrepreneurial? Or should I just go back to software? And like I had summer internships that were great. Like I could do that. And I think what's hard for me is, as I've actually listened to some of your other guests that you've had on the show, you've had a couple of folks that have had strong passions and realized early what they want to do.
Yeah.
I fall into the category of the other set of folks, which is I'm interested in a lot of things, but I don't have a strong professional passion. It's really for me impact, intellectual curiosity, and continued growth. So how I end up in the law is I saw a posting for a so-called technology specialist at a firm called Fish & Richardson, which is an IP boutique. So I learned as I was interviewing, they had took on a contingency fee case, which means that they received proceeds from the outcome of the case. And when you have those kinds of cases, this is IP litigation, they typically try and staff it lightly and reduce costs to earn a better return. And so they were looking for someone with a technology background to help with the case. And so I thought, well, I don't know anything about the law, but I understand computer architecture, which was what the subject matter of the case was. And so it felt like a great way to marry technology and something new that I didn't know much about. And so that was my first foray into the law before I was a lawyer. And that started me on my journey.
So you worked as a technical specialist at Fish & Richardson and you became really fascinated by patent law, I'm assuming? Is that what, obviously, then you decided to go to law school after that?
So that's what got me into IP law and patent law. Maybe I'll tell you a little bit more about my experience there before law school. So like I said, this case was super lightly staffed and I was very fortunate. It was an important case for the firm. So to start, there was actually only 2 other partners on the case. And one of the partners was a fellow named Robert Hillman, who was actually the chairman of the firm at that time and is the person who's credited with growing Fish to be a national firm. And so I was first tasked with doing document review. The case was a company called Biax, and they were suing Apple, IBM, and Motorola. And so you can imagine at that time in the early 2000s, 3 very big name companies, lots and lots of documents coming in. I think and this was before e-discovery. So I hand reviewed probably 200 bankers' boxes worth of documents in my early days. But what I learned there was I was the only person who actually understood what was being provided by the other side, because I'm the one who actually looked at everything. And so it made me indispensable in that case. I had access to all the docs that were relevant for different issues. I could find them all. I was the one who organized them all, not in an electronic system, but in my own kind of way. And so that led me to attending some, 50 depositions. I sat right next to the partner who was taking the depositions. I would hand him documents. We take breaks. I tell him, oh, there was a document that says this, that, or the other. And then that led to, in Massachusetts, there's a way for non-lawyers to practice under the guidance of a lawyer. And so that led me to more deeply engage on briefs and motions and other things like that. And then we actually kind of went to court a couple of times. I saw a Parkman hearing. I saw a bunch of other things. And so eventually I realized, oh, this is actually very cool. Like there's a large intellectual component to this of figuring out what was patented, figuring out what the other product does, interesting arguments to be made on like what it is that your invention is or isn't. And I should go to law school because the lawyers are making a lot more money than I am, and I've actually figured out what most of this is now. And so that's what caused me to apply to law school.
Uh-huh. And how did you like law school? I mean, it sounds like you knew so much more than your average law school student, but what did you think of law school?
I loved law school. I ended up not really doing many IP classes because I thought I understood that space relatively well, given my professional experience.
Right.
And so I tried to delve into lots of different areas. I did some tax, I did some securities. I spent a lot of my time actually on negotiation. And so one of the things I learned in law school was that I enjoyed doing negotiations. So I spent a lot of time at the Harvard negotiation program.
Mm.
I think the thing I liked the most about law school was just the variety of people. There were people that were interested in public service. There were people interested in politics. There were people interested in going to law firms. And I would say kind of my favorite experience in law school was in one of the clinics. I got to represent underserved folks that were having difficulty with their landlords in landlord-tenant law, and got to actually go to a trial and see what at least what I would describe as a slumlord landlord who wasn't providing any services to tenants. And you actually feel great when you like manage to make someone else's life meaningfully better. And so,
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, law school was a great experience.
So after law school, then did you go back to doing IP law, or did you go on to choose a different area of law to focus on?
I was torn actually, and I will say I learned from my past experiences. So if you remember, like out of MIT, I went to do investment banking, which was I think kind of the thing to do.
Yeah.
So after law school, I was trying to decide what to do next, and I spent my summers again at Fish and Richardson, but I also spent one of my summers at Davis Polk, which is a well-known, for full-service shop, but I focus on M&A. Uh-huh. And I realized at that time that I should follow my heart, which was to go back to Fish, rather than go to, at that time, what was kind of a more well-known firm. Uh-huh. Mostly because I thought I still really liked IP, and I was very comfortable with the folks at Fish. Mm-hmm. It also helped that, as I said, I spent a lot of time on negotiation. And so one of the things I did, which I haven't heard anyone else meaningfully do, is I went to Fish and I negotiated for advanced standing coming out of law school, so I could be a more senior associate given my experience. Mm-hmm. So that also helped.
So then, so you went back to Fish and did IP litigation. At what point did you, obviously you went in-house at some point, which is where you're at now. How did that transition happen and what prompted you to do that?
So I spent another 2 or 3 years at Fish, and I went from being kind of the guy who was focused on the technology as the core role to a person who was managing cases, and so second chair-ish on smaller cases, not anything large, but building the skills for how do you organize a case, how do you do the day-to-day work with the opposing law firm to kind of keep the case moving forward, how do you strategically frame a case, and what I realized was my strengths and interests lie in kind of the strategy of the case and like what are the arguments and so forth. My interest lied less in two things that I just didn't want to do for my career. One was most patent litigation at that time happened in the Eastern District of Texas or other far-flung places, and so I wasn't interested in traveling and spending lots of time there. And the second is you increasingly see that the senior partners are focused on business development and building those relationships to try and bring in the work as doing the work. And so I felt like I was more interested in the doer, not the bringing in of the work. So I actually wasn't planning to go anywhere, but there's a fellow named Robert Kramer who presented at Fish and Richardson. He was the founder of a company called Altitude Capital Partners, which was a patent monetization shop, more pejoratively called a patent troll. And well, another lesson in my career that I've learned is kind of sometimes you get lucky, but it helps to try and make your own luck. And so after he spoke, I reached out to him myself and expressed interest in kind of like what he was doing, because I thought it was a great marriage of the IP litigation experience that I had, but also the financial experience I had had at the investment bank, and then kind of a technology thread running through it. So for me, it was like a dream job. At that time, I remember when I said I was leaving, one of the partners said to me, what are you doing? You're throwing away your career by going here. But I've embraced kind of, like I said, if something sounds interesting, it's actually great to do. My calculus was, this is something different that most people don't do, so it's going to distinguish me. Like I will look different than other folks. And, as a worst case, I can always go back to IP litigation because I will be viewed as someone not only who's done IP litigation, but who understands the inner workings of how patent monetization works through kind of someone who does that as an institutional job. That job was not an easy job to get. I still vividly remember I was living in Boston and they were in New York, and I took the train down 3 times on my own dime to go and meet him, just to try and like convince him that he should hire me. There were only 5 people at this place. And then on the 3rd time, he said to me, we've really enjoyed meeting with you, but like, I'm not sure like we should move forward. And I said, well, like, why? I thought like things were going really well. And he said to me, what I really want is someone who can source more deals for us. And I'm not sure like you're going to be able to source the deals that I want you to source. And I remember saying to him, that's interesting you say that, because like, in effect, I've sourced you. Like I found you, you didn't know me. I reached out to you. I found you. I've come down here 3 times, and now you and I are talking, and we seem to have a good rapport. And so a lesson is like to kind of continue to advocate for yourself. And so ultimately he hired me, and probably one of the better things I've done for myself in my career, because I learned how to source deals, model deals, like financially in Excel the way that like he would teach me, negotiate agreements, manage law firms. What's interesting is I moved from being an associate at a law firm to hiring the very senior most partners that I would have worked for to run cases for us at that time. And so you just have a different lens through which you are doing that work.
Interesting, because one of the things you said you didn't like about being at a law firm was, getting clients, business development, and in a way, sourcing deals is very much like business development, isn't it?
It is, although it's a little bit different, because I felt, at least at a law firm, when you're trying to get work, you're doing it on the back of your experience, and it's really like sales of how good you are.
Right.
In this role, it was you have IP that is not being monetized. We have money and we can help you. And so there was a more compelling pitch to be made of let us help you financially unlock this asset that you have.
Perhaps. Interesting. Okay. So you did that, and then at some point I'm going to hear about how you moved into a company, but maybe there's another step here in between.
No, the next step is I found my way to Google, and similar kind of thing, actually. I was sitting on the couch watching TV, and I was on social media. I was on LinkedIn, and I saw a role for, I don't remember what it was called, an IP manager or like acquisition manager at Google. And I asked my wife, like, oh, what do you think? Should I apply? And she's like, oh yeah, go for it. Like, what harm could come of this? So this was the time of, this is like the early 2010s when the smartphone patent wars were just getting started. And Google was in a position where it was a very large company, but its IP position was relatively light to the size of its company. And so they were looking for someone who could help build their IP portfolio. and build it not organically, but through acquisition. So finding relevant IP that would help and deter kind of the IP actions that were happening. And so, again, I actually feel like super lucky I found Google at that time. But I don't think there was another candidate like me at that time, because my pitch to Google was, I know how to source deals now, which is what you want to do. You want to buy these IP assets. I know how to evaluate them because I've done the financial work of it. I understand IP because I've been an IP litigator for many years now. And I have a deep technical background, so I can understand all the different technical areas that Google has where you'd want to kind of buy IP. And so I went through that process and started at Google in 2010, and that was my first role. I was tasked with spending a lot of money to help build the IP position at Google. And I think we did some 100+ deals over the couple years that I did that. Many small deals, but large deals. There was a Nortel patent auction where Google was not the winner of this, but I have vivid memories of we're in an auction room at a law firm in New York, and it's in bankruptcy, and we're bidding in $100 million increments for this IP portfolio, and it goes for $4.5 billion to another consortium of companies.
Wow.
So anyway, it turned out that like I had built an interesting skill set that happened to be relevant at that time.
So then how did you finally make your transition from Google into Waymo? I assume that, I mean, how did that happen?
So, well, the next thread for me to Google, I'll get to Waymo in a moment, but the next thread for me at Google was, I've now done IP litigation at a law firm.
Yeah.
I've done transactional work related to IP through acquisition and licensing and so forth.
Yeah.
The piece that I was missing was kind of IP strategy, IP prosecution. And so I had built trust at Google. And so this was now a time where they kindly gave me an opportunity to do something different. And it was also the first time that I managed a team at Google. So I managed first the YouTube and the social kind of patent portfolio and patent team, and then the Android and consumer hardware teams. So I actually thought like, oh, like I'm on the path to like, now I've checked basically the 3 boxes for IP experience, litigation, transactional, and prosecution. I'm on the path to being a chief IP officer somewhere over time. And then lo and behold, I had my second son and I was on paternity leave. And I think one of the things that I've observed for myself at least is day-to-day things are really busy when you're at work, but when you take a step back and you are away for a little bit, it gives you more perspective, like broad. So I contemplated my meaning of life while I was on that paternity leave, and I learned that what is now Waymo at that time was something called Project Chauffeur, was on its way to be spun out of Google to a standalone company. And I decided, oh, that sounds really interesting, like self-driving cars. Who wouldn't want to work on that? And so I got introduced to the chief legal officer at what would be Waymo. And so that was the start of my discussion about should I join Waymo or not. And so that happened over my paternity leave. It was a really good dialogue. I think, so his name is Kevin Vosen. He was my former manager. He actually managed me for 7 years at Waymo before I took on this role. And what became clear to me was he was calling out what he thought all the important things were to build a successful self-driving car company from a legal perspective. Excuse me. And one of the things he said, I think I really appreciate it, actually, he's very self-aware. He said, I've got a bunch of skills, but like one place where I'm not as deep is IP. And I think IP is gonna be really important in this space. So there was a natural fit in kind of the experience set that I brought with what Waymo needed. And so I said, I would love to come, but I want this to be a growth opportunity for me. So like, yes, I know IP, but can I do something else alongside IP? And so when I joined, I managed our IP and our commercial functions.
So at some point, I'm assuming you had to also learn corporate. I'm assuming that's coming to the picture now, because in order to be chief legal officer, I'm assuming that's also part of your stuff that you're responsible for now.
Like I said, my journey started with IP and commercial, but yes, corporate is now in my mandate along with a bunch of other things. What I found is that throughout my career, as I did good work, one of my mantras is be excellent, do the best you can. I just kept getting more and more responsibility. And so that responsibility started with IP and commercial and then grew to employment legal, corporate legal, trade compliance, competition, and so forth. To the point where I was owning a bunch of things, and my role started, I think I was the second lawyer that joined. So started as an individual contributor, and then grew a small team, and then had a much larger team, and then kind of became a trusted advisor to our chief legal officer.
So, and then how long have you had this current role?
I'm actually relatively new as chief legal officer. I've been chief legal officer now for about 6 months.
Okay. And how big is your team now?
So I manage 3 functions. It's not a core legal role. It's all of legal, which includes the areas that I just called out, but also product counseling, regulatory compliance, privacy, security, and that all falls under the mandate of legal. But I also have risk and insurance, which is somewhat ironic. I think I said to you earlier, I wanted to be an actuary at one point in my career. And so now I get to manage an insurance team that has actuaries on it. And then also our public policy team that's responsible for government and stakeholder outreach.
And how many people is that, roughly?
Roughly 60 or 70, something like that.
Okay. And so in your role as chief legal officer now, are you pretty much mostly delegating, or do you do the work yourself, or kind of how do you manage the workflow, I guess is the question.
I think over time I've learned what my management style is, and so I would say it as follows. I think when you have a larger team, you have to delegate, and I'm super blessed that we have what I think is like a best-in-class team across all the teams that I manage. I think people actually want to feel accountable and responsible and have an impact, and so I really try and empower my folks to do the work, make decisions, have a company lens as they're making decisions. But I also don't want people to be out on an island. And so there's a balance of staying informed, staying involved, being around for places where people need help. So I've tried to kind of balance those two things. And so I would say I'm reasonably hands-on where it's warranted. I would say I like to pick my spots. And so my management style is kind of situational dependent. So if things are going well and it's something that someone knows really well, I will happily defer to the expert, because most people on my team at this point, for their specific areas of expertise, know far more than I do. But for other things where you're putting someone in a new role, or it's something that's really important for the company, I will delve deeper and be more involved.
Interesting. Well, I realize this early in this role, so you probably haven't given this much thought, but I was just curious. I mean, you talked a little bit about how your legal skills have slowly, accumulated to the point now where you've kind of reached the pinnacle of, let's say, an in-house position. Do you think ever that in your career, which is still pretty long ahead, that you might do something completely outside of legal at some point? Like, do a business role? You kind of dabbled that at one point, or do you think that you will stay being a lawyer? Have you given any of that thought?
So Waymo has been really kind to me. I managed our corporate development team for about a year and a half, maybe. So I've managed non-legal teams here. Uh, I'm really enjoying kind of the chief legal role. As I said, I'm still kind of in my early days in the first few innings of my role.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I said to you before, which I'll echo again, is I have a learning and growth mindset. I always want to keep learning, no matter how far I progress. I also think it's perfectly okay to take thoughtful risks. I think that helps differentiate you. I'm a big believer in what I call the power of compound interest, which is like do a little bit extra every day on something that you find interesting that's different, and that compounds over time to get you to actually knowing more things. And then I'd say maybe lastly, like you're fortunate if you have great managers who help guide you, but ultimately it's your own career, and it's yours to figure out and frame goals for yourself and figure out kind of the steps to get there. And so I think like I would not be surprised if sometime down the road I decide I want to do something different. I think what you'll probably see is I like the idea of like bringing the experience you have and the wisdom you have to bear to the next thing. And so I think it's hard to do something that's completely different. But you could imagine doing something that's not a legal role, but somewhere where the legal background is helpful for whatever it is that is next. And so could that be like a startup that is focused on the law, maybe? Or could it be a business role that like has close ties to legal issues? Like, yeah, absolutely. It can be any of those things.
Yeah. Well, Amar, this has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate your taking the time. If you do decide to do something else, please come back and tell me about it.
I will. Thank you so much for having me, Richard.
This is Richard Hsu and Amar Mehta. Thanks.